and I'm delighted to welcome 4 panel members, well, 5 when Philip joins us. I'm sure that'll be shortly. And we're going to be looking at a number of the public policy issues that emerge based on the issues that have been raised during the last hour or two on the summit. So firstly, I would like to welcome, I'll just go through the panel members, and starting off with David Levine, who is the Executive Director, Chief Executive of NP11, which I had never heard of up to a month or so ago, but apparently brings together all the 11 LEPs, which are based in the north, and does some great things with them. So very much able to give that, what I call on the ground perspective in terms of where the LEPs are focused. Next, in my view, I have David Phillips, who is a senior civil servant. He is responsible at DD level, director level, excuse me, deputy director level for the Northern Powerhouse. So has a very, very important role at a more strategic level, but I'm sure getting down into a lot of detail as well in terms of moving forward that particular very important political and economic agenda. The third panel member is Ingo Borkert. Now, Ingo is a fellow of a group called the United Kingdom Trade Policy Observatory, which is based in the University of Sussex and is a joint venture with Chatham House, as I understand it. And he is going to look at very much more the international flows and what are the issues that he sees from his broad global perspective influencing this onshoring agenda. So thank you for that. And the next panel member is Janet Young, and she is the, I'll get this correctly, the Government Chief Property Officer. I think I got that one right, based in the Cabinet Office. And as they said on the thing, she has oversight for all matters to do with property, as well as being the sort of pastoral leader of the 4,000 or so property professionals who work for the government. So fascinating role. So welcome to you, Janet. And Philip Mccann, I don't know if Philip's having some technical difficulties. He was in the green room with us, but hopefully he'll be joining us shortly. And Philip Mccann is probably the foremost economic geographer of his generation. He is at the University of Sheffield. He's also heads the space and place, I think it's called place and productivity. Anyway, I'm sorry, I got that slightly wrong, but within the new Productivity Institute at the University of Manchester Business School, that's his role. So the way we're going to look at it is we've got 4 or 5 areas that we're going to be focusing on during this panel session. And the intention is to see if we can bring different perspectives to the same issue. And the first one I really wanted to look at was the one that's quite topical, particularly with the COVID world, which is the extent that a permanent shift to hybrid working may be leading to new opportunities for hiring northern talent, maybe without the need for a physical presence. And I'd like to invite David Phillips, if I may, to give us his thoughts in terms of the extent to which the Northern Powerhouse is looking into that aspect of North Shoring. In other words, the hybrid working, and where people from other regions, companies in other regions, are looking to hire people in the North as part of the improvement of the North. So over to you, David, and your mic is mute, as you're probably aware.
Brilliant, thank you. So I actually think it could be absolutely transformational, this. But of course, things work in both directions. So in the same way that someone from the north could do a job anywhere that currently is done in London, someone in London could also do a job for the Orkneys. And I think one of the things we have to consider is what is the right balance between having that local knowledge, local credibility, living in the environment, understanding the issues that affect local people, really from a policy perspective, living it and breathing it, because that's really important too. So just because you have a technical ability to do something and could take a job doesn't take away the reality that your credibility matters, and it matters amongst local stakeholders. It matters in terms of the policies that you develop for government, for example. So I think it's kind of a mixed thing. For me, at a personal level within government, I think it's been an utterly transformational experience, because we are quite a London-centric organisation. It allows us to actually participate wherever we are in the country on a level playing field with colleagues elsewhere. And I think if we can get over the the challenges of doing more creative work in this kind of environment, I think it really transformational for how we actually do things in the future.
That's really interesting. Janet, do you have any thoughts? I mean, your property professionals are scattered all over the country. Are they finding it working more effectively under this new hybrid working context?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other responsibilities that I've got actually is for the government estate strategy, which includes the plan to relocate roles from London and the South East. And that's what a lot of these property professionals are working on to support that decision making. I agree with what David has just said. I think you know, in fact, I think the civil services is about to produce a summary of the impact of the lockdown on its productivity, which I think is probably going on gov.uk tomorrow. And it was a survey of about 25,000 civil servants and how effectively they worked during the pandemic. And it was very high level. I think it's about 80% of people said that they could work very productively from home. Of course, that leaves 20% that couldn't, and that was often because they're in unsuitable living accommodation, don't have space. So I think I agree with David. It has been absolutely transformational, and do watch out for that report. But I think that isn't the only answer, because certainly from the point of view of public policy, it's yes, we can do quite a lot from our desks, and I'm sort of sitting in my home at the moment in a bedroom doing this call, and we can do quite a lot. But actually the real drive for relocating those roles is twofold. First of all, it's about putting good quality jobs outside of London and the South East, with all the economic stimulus that goes with that. And people will then put down roots in other parts of the country. They will buy property there, and they will use the education facilities. They'll shop in those areas, but also they will then bring having people working in the civil service in those regions means we'll bring a much richer diversity of thought into policy making, because to genuinely create policy for the public sector, we want to have a geographically diverse input, as well as all the other diversity characteristics. So I agree with David. I think it has been absolutely transformational, but I just think we've got to be careful that we don't assume that just then, if you like, solves the problem.
Yeah, I understand. Ingo, from your sort of broader World Bank and other studies that you've done, I mean, are we a very centralized country from that point of view? Are we sort of other trends that you think are worth sharing?
Probably not more centralized than France anyway, with the big Paris region, right? So let me point out to another opportunity really here that comes just about at the right moment. Now, Raquel has mentioned Brexit before, so I figure I'm allowed to say it, and I'm not the bad guy who's first time mentioning the B word. But exiting the EU single market is around the corner. And in my work with the UK Parliament, with the Lords EU Select Committee, and we were talking to professional services firms, one thing that became very clear was some of the top things that worried firms were cross-border data flows and access to talent. Now we've heard in previous sessions and a couple of fantastic pitches from an array of northern cities of just how much talent is there. But people are, and that's not specific to the UK, people are very reluctant to move even within the same country. That's true for any Western Hemisphere country. And so I would think that exiting the EU single market might create a void of talent that has previously come in one form or another from the continent to fill this relatively swiftly and promptly through the new technologies of teleworking and telemigrating in an international context, and help professional services firms out. And the prospects for that seem to be really great now, believing the previous sessions. I would also, however, second Janet's cautionary note. I think ever since the March lockdown, we are still in crisis mode, right? And to what extent that's going to be viable in the medium term remains to be seen. And I think, and that's nothing to do with me being a trade economist, I'd just be cautious not to implicitly discriminate against people who might have certain personal circumstances, right? Living accommodations differ, caring responsibilities differ. And if you throw everybody into this remote working world, which holds a whole range, undoubtedly, of opportunities, we ought to be, very careful that we don't leave, certain groups behind.
That's kind. Yeah, I mean, David Levine. That is. I mean, we've kind of, that's, if you like, at a sort of trade policy economic level, but coming down to the sort of the LEPs and the 11 LEPs who are part of NP11. I mean, to what extent are they shifting their strategy based on this new reality, if I can use that simplistic way of expressing it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, picking up on some of the threads of some of the other speakers, thinking about this question, two opportunities and sort of one risk occurred to me. The first is that I think there's going to be a much greater emphasis on quality of life and affordability for people. So if the reality is that distance matters less, I think people are going to be chasing quality of life, and I think the North has a real offer there. So the kind of persistent public policy challenge that LEPs have often identified is the sort of brain drain down to London and the South East. If you're from Wigan or Barnsley or Middlesbrough or whatever, this feeling that if you're going to get a kind of high quality job, you can't stay where you're from, you have to move down to London and the South East, and perhaps that is going to matter less. So in terms of kind of retention of talent, I think that's a big opportunity, as well as attraction of talent, and the North has a really good offer in terms of quality of life, in terms of affordability compared to London and the South East. As part of our place work, we're looking to pull together a live, work, invest proposition that will kind of have recommendations for public policy. You mentioned, Richard, that you hadn't heard of NP11 before a couple of weeks ago. That's deliberate. LEPs are the front door, and where we want people to go in most cases. Our relationship is primarily with government, so I care that David Phillips knows who I am, but the live, work, invest proposition is probably going to be the first thing that we do that is kind of much kind of broader. The second, I think, opportunity is if people are chasing quality of life, I think employers are going to be chasing skills, and as David said, as a wider pool of talent needs a greater emphasis on high skilled employees in your locality, and so that obviously has major public policy ramifications, as you'd expect, given who we are. We're big fans of devolution, and we'd point to a lot of the real successes where particularly adult education has been devolved to a more local level, to a combined authority and to mayors and so on, to kind of get better outcomes. The note of caution, and a couple of people have mentioned sort of potential issues. Sorry, am I the only one that's getting some background noise? I'm getting a bit of background noise. Maybe it's just
I think your mic's a bit crackly, to be honest. So it's just
anyway. What I was going to say in terms of the kind of potential risk is, without kind of being the party pooper, I think increased remote working has some downsides that we need to be quite conscious of. When it comes to the opportunities for collaboration that people find in shared spaces, in offices, when it comes to the impact on mental as well as physical health of home working and remote working, I think we can't lose sight of those, and that will also likely require a public policy response. And then just finally, in terms of what this means for LEPs, so I think, like always, there's a need for agility, on behalf of both the public and private sector. So, we've been hearing some really interesting examples, for example, around the creative sector and the creative industry, that having lots and lots of freelancers in London with suddenly very little to do, being forced almost to partner up with independent, firms in other parts of the country, including the North. that's led to a lot of collaborations and a lot of work that is now being commissioned out of the north, and LEPs have been very agile in responding to that and in providing support for that. So I suppose that's the obvious and almost kind of non-answer, which is to say that we just need, I think, to be even more agile and responsive to opportunities as they arise.
And there was an interesting, I was on a call which Andy Haldane organised for LEPs a few months ago, and talking about some of the challenges that are facing the LEPs. So we'll perhaps pick that up shortly. Philip, welcome. Philip Mccann, I think I mentioned him briefly, but when we were talking and saying that Philip is described as the foremost social scientist of his generation, big smiles for him, but more importantly has written some really, I think, amazingly important, particularly book on regional geography. And we were really focusing a little bit about what the hybrid working changes might mean in terms of new opportunities. David Phillips was saying that it could go both ways. It could be just as much sort of northern firms hiring south as southern firms hiring north. And Janet was talking about how the whole sort of civil service report coming out very, very shortly will be kind of just giving a good insight as to how 25,000 civil servants are now working, and how that will, from policy terms, will allow more people to be engaged based around the UK rather than all being London centric. And by the way, David, thank you for introducing me to David Levine. As you say, it was sort of not a low key, not that well known, so all good. Philip, I'm particularly interested in, now that you have this dual role on the sort of newly formed Productivity Institute at the Alliance Management Business School. What are your sort of plans in terms of, do you see that this change in hybrid working is going to lead to significant shifts in the way that policy might be shaped to improve productivity? I think start with that, if I may.
Well, thank you, Richard. I apologise for coming in late just at the start of the session. The link broke down completely and I couldn't get back in. So this is third or fourth time to get back in anyway. I'm delighted to be here. I think the changes which have been brought by the pandemic are likely to be very, very fundamental. I think most people accept that. There's a lot of evidence now from many, many different countries that the patterns of working are fundamentally going to change. So it's not just a matter of working more from home. For example, where people previously might be working 1 day a week, now they'll be working 2 or 3 days a week. It's much more fundamental than that, because of course, changes in working patterns of this form, using technology in different ways, exactly as we're doing now, also is going to imply organizational restructuring within companies, the logic of how businesses work, how decisions are made, who's given roles for decisions, who's given the accountability, but who's also given the autonomy. And all of this is really up for grabs now. So for people who are interested in this area, and of course, you know, the kind of communities that the managing partners are dealing with, business advisors, consultants, and so on, are really going to be absolutely in the center of these changes. These changes are going to be profound in the sense that they'll be thinking about reconfiguring business space. As we know, huge numbers of companies already are reconfiguring their office setups because they realize that different opportunities, different operations, activities can be done in different ways, in different settings, in different spatial settings. So all of this is happening. At the same time, there's also been a lot of companies who've accelerated the rate of change in terms of their take-up of new IT systems of different forms. Again, that's forcing a rethink in terms of organizational types of relationships. So there's a lot out there. It's too early to say, of course, what those implications are, but I think there are a few things we can point to. So one of them is, as we know, the UK has this characteristic that decision-making, knowledge flows tend to be very truncated around London and its broad hinterland. We know that Andy Haldane's description of the UK economy as being a hub with no spokes. I think Andy has been dead on, basically. There's lots of data on this. This is a chance to restructure that, to kind of reset that. So I think that's one of the issues. Our companies and businesses and localities also, cities, regions, whatever, business clusters, able to kind of reset that in different ways to take advantage of these new opportunities. So that's one big issue. At the same time, also, there's a reskilling agenda. That these technological changes are going to have profound organizational changes, and they're also going to change the nature of work roles and activities. Again, people interested in management, decision-making structures, and so on. A lot of this is up in the air, and our skills training systems are going to be need to be fundamentally rejigged. We're just not catching up with the speed of change. So that's a big area as well. So the skills system is going to be crucial. The technological decision-making relationships inside businesses. And then I think the third part is also, you've touched on the role of the governance systems as well, around LEPs, around catapult systems, around city regions. All of these changes that will be taking place within the private sector, we need to see some sort of mapping onto the public and civil society sectors as well. We need them to change as well, so that these things dovetail in a better manner. What are the outcomes? It's far too early to tell. It's far too early, but we do know that change is coming, and it's coming on a huge scale. And I think there's really no question of that.
And perhaps focusing a little bit more on the productivity aspect. Obviously, the Productivity Institute, £32 million investment by government, fairly very much a change from the more traditional industrial strategy. To what extent do you think the remit of the Productivity Institute will change, or is again that too early to say?
Well, in many ways, the Productivity Institute has been established at just the right moment. I mean, obviously, when the bids went in for the design of the Institute, no one could have foreseen what we were up against. But literally, at the time of the launch of the Institute, we've just had this tsunami of economic, monetary, organizational shocks on scales which are really hard to comprehend from any prior experience. So I think the Productivity Institute really has, on one level, got its work cut out. On the other level, it's tremendous that it's been launched at this moment, because the kind of thinking we're going to need has to be cross-cutting. It has to be crossing sectors, methodologies, different ways of framing discussions. We need all hands to the pump. And I think the Institute is just, fortunately, ideally set up to do exactly that at this crucial moment. So for those of us working in the institution, obviously I'm leading on the geography in place. That's the regional leveling up theme. On one hand, potentially we're dealing with an economic and social tragedy. On the other hand, we're dealing with something which, could be setting new precedents in terms of how to move forward, technology, driving productivity, new work relationships, thinking about relationships between capital and skills. All of this is now on the table, but it's been thrown up in the air, and we're looking at how the pieces are falling onto that table. So from an academic's point of view, it's an amazing opportunity. But I think as a national issue, the Institute is just, we're really fortunate, to be honest, that the Institute has been established at this moment.
Oh, thank you very much for that. And I'm David Phillips now, just sort of coming back to you. And obviously we've had quite a few observations from other panel members, and just looking at this whole issue of growth of jobs, which I think is probably one of the key dimensions behind the North shoring, the Northern Powerhouse. I mean, what are the sort of particular areas that you think you would be focusing on now that maybe 6 or 9 months ago you probably wouldn't have seen as important?
Well, the obvious ones, things like e-commerce. So from the current crisis, there have been opportunities. So we've had growth across a range of industries. The medical products and things is an unsurprising one. But for example, e-learning, providing services abroad, all of that is kind of taken off quite significantly. So I think there's a big natural growth there. I think generally what I'm particularly interested in is not just numbers of jobs, but the quality of jobs. And sometimes I think we can get a little bit focused on a particular announcement around some FDI that's come in and has provided 500 jobs. But are those jobs of the nature that they will create a virtuous cycle and encourage more and more people into that area, more and more investment by providing a stronger and stronger supply chain? So for me, it's about looking at the whole picture, not just pure numbers of jobs.
And Ingo, from that measurement perspective, I mean, how do you go about assessing the quality of jobs when you're doing your metrics? You're mute, I think.
No, I'm unmuted. Thank you. The quality of jobs, I should say that, professional services firms are, I think, unsung heroes in many respects, but one of the ways in which they're also unsung is their contribution to productivity, in the sense that they are, amongst other things, very crucial contributors in their various services inputs to the manufacturing base and to exports in particular, which is one area I've studied a bit in the past. So, it's in that sense, professional services firms are very crucial to upping productivity and leveling up. Even though for the bad reasons of measurement or looking at the wrong place, these productivity advances might not show up in the professional services firms, but elsewhere, where professional services firms are contributing to. So I think it's quite important that there's a range of, well-paid, high-skill intensive services, all the way from branding to regulation intensive services like legal advice, getting finance, and all the rest of it, that are being produced and consumed domestically, but also traded internationally, which is the area I know more about, directly, but also indirectly embodied into sophisticated manufacturing exports. And that's, of course, and the numbers are just big, right? I think just northern regions such as the Northwest, the Northeast, and Yorkshire, I think are exporting 40 billion worth of services just last year, 2019. That's not small beer, at least not to my modest mind. And another about, I guess, 13 or so billion embodied indirectly into manufacturing exports, which is a lot. And so we know that firms who export are generally more productive. That's a point I wanted to pick up from what David Phillips was just saying a minute ago about e-commerce and the way in which the COVID crisis has thrown a spotlight on how e-services, partially procured from abroad, has saved the day in many respects. We know that these exporting firms, both manufacturing as well as services firms, are more productive than not internationally active firms for a number of reasons, but partly because there is learning by exporting. Once a firm has cracked and jumped the hurdle of tapping into exporting markets, there are scale economies and all the rest of it. There's a host of reasons for that, and we're not going to solve the productivity puzzle in autarky, are we? So I think that sort of international angle is quite important. We also know, and this comes back to the quality. I'm not sure how to measure it other than looking at the wages, but we know that wages of both managers and workers in internationally active firms are much higher, and also are in terms of lifetime earnings, are on a steeper trajectory, and that reflects the experience of being internationally active, and these higher wages, of course, but reflect the higher productivity. Otherwise, there wouldn't be, higher wages from a macroeconomic perspective. And so, I think north shoring, could be harnessed for this in very useful ways. Because when I work with SMEs, I think informational asymmetries are one very important hurdle. And if this north shoring, this collaboration between firms in the north and in the south, and as David said, possibly a two-way dialogue, really, rather than one-way, could lead to firm on one end providing the information that help another firm, either in the south or in the north, to become internationally active. I think that could potentially make a huge impact in terms of productivity going forward.
Janet, from the Cabinet Office perspective, or the sort of what the sort of I mean, I know that there's a big focus on FDI, there's a big focus on the jobs, quality jobs, etc. I mean, to what extent is this partnering area that Ingo's just mentioned, this idea of existing firms? We had an excellent example in session 1 today with Kites in Manchester and Blake in Oxford area. I mean, to what extent is that seen in policy terms as important, encouraging firms to work together? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. But just very quickly on the excuse me, on the last point, in terms of how the sort of metrics that government's using to measure the sort of quality of jobs. I mean, very simplistically, we do use sort of seniority of roles and pay. And one of the things that is very different, I think, about this particular programme to move government roles out of London and the South East is that we are very much measuring it by the number of senior roles that will be moved. Certainly in the past, it's been very focused on corporate service roles or more junior roles, but we really strongly feel that we need to get sort of clusters of senior decision makers. In terms of the partnering point, in terms of partnering with industry, I'm probably not the best qualified to talk about that, but one thing that I can talk about is partnering across the public sector, and we really strongly believe that there's a lot more that we do a lot between central government and local authorities, but I think there's so much more that we can do. We've certainly been trying to do that from a placemaking point of view, partnering up with local authorities through a programme we host called One Public Estate that tries to bring owners of public real estate together in a place sort of very much sort of led by the local authority in that area, but looking at, you know, how to sort of partner and collaborate. But in terms of your the real gist of your question, Richard, and I can't really comment on that. I mean, whether David can, I don't know.
So, David, do you have any thoughts on the extent to which government public policy is focusing on encouraging private sector firms to partner with each other as a way of addressing these various gaps we've been talking about today?
Assuming you're asking me, David, rather than David Phillips.
I'm happy for either David to run with that baton.
Well,
maybe you both have views. That would be great.
Yeah.
Great, yeah.
So you know, we like to say that the great thing about the North is that there's large enough that there are lots of commercial opportunities for everyone, but small enough that a lot of collaboration can take place. And you know, I think again touching on some earlier comments, you know, some sectors are really thriving as a result of recent events, and there are real opportunities there. You know, in health and life sciences, you know, there's been a huge opportunity for the role of the innovation ecosystem in supplying the health services. You know, LEPs have facilitated some really excellent collaboration between academia and pharmaceutical companies. Obviously, very topical at the moment. There's certainly going to be new digital economy opportunities that the other David mentioned. There's a lot of opportunities around clean growth and clean energy. To strengthen our energy resilience, and I think again resilience is very topical at the moment. How can we kind of strengthen our energy resilience, energy security? And you know, you saw that in the recent spending review. The point I was going to make, kind of following on from the mention of the spending review, is that in public policy terms, the intervention there, I think, is that government does need to make sure it is incentivising collaboration, and you know, we were really pleased to see the emphasis, you know, using clean growth as an example, the emphasis on clean growth in the spending review. There's good policy fit there, there's good policy alignment there, but the way that it seems to be structured, and there's lots of details still to work out, but the way that it seems to be structured is a very kind of traditional, there are going to be national pots of money that people need to compete in order to bid into, and that, you know, there should be healthy competition, but actually if we are going to have the kind of collaboration I think that you're talking about, Richard, there does need to be mechanisms, there do need to be frameworks within certainly opportunities for government funding to kind of allow meaningful collaboration across different sectors, across different parts of the North, in order to kind of maximise those commercial opportunities. So I think there's an interesting public policy dimension to that there.
Yeah, it's a sort of pump priming role in a way, isn't it? Because you know that if you're starting to investigate a collaboration with another organisation, you're going to spend quite a lot of time finding out about each other, and is this something that's actually worth doing? And again, we heard earlier on how one of them had met in a bar at a conference, and you know, now they've got 12 years of working together very effectively, one firm based in the North, one based in the South. So I sense, again, David Phillips perhaps possibly may have help with this, but you know, to what extent is that type of collaboration seen as something that is worthy of active support by government?
It's an interesting question, because to be honest, the private sector companies cluster together anyway. I mean, how many times you've been on a high street and you see very similar businesses all next to each other, and naturally businesses tend to either physically be near each other or at least to have strong connections. So that kind of happens naturally, and you then have the competition and learning that can spread between the two. You have people moving between the businesses, so it's all kept within the areas of expertise that those businesses have. So I think the role is really where there is some kind of market failure. So what's not working, that means we have to get involved, because the principle of good government, I would suggest, is not that we jump in and intervene at every possible opportunity. So if there is something in the system that is not working, that I think is when there is a place for government to step in and try and catalyse it, to encourage relationships to develop, to bring different companies together in a similar kind of way that we've done with a lot of the vaccine production, where you put the money up ahead of time so that the businesses will then go away and start producing the product that you want at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I sense that, but I mean, a cluster is normally thought of in terms of Northampton and the motor racing industry. It's a physically geographical close area, the high street you mentioned. And to me, North Shoring is about, in a way, is building links between those clusters, which possibly don't exist at the moment. And that's kind of where I was looking at it more, because I think it may not be a market failure, that's probably too strong a word, but it certainly isn't as efficient at the moment as it could be, I sense, and that people do tend to stay local, be local, and we now have an opportunity, as we've heard from Philip, to do things in a completely different way. And this may be I won't say the end of geography, because that's an overrated term, but this may well lead to other ways of bringing people together that maybe they wouldn't necessarily feel was something that they had done before, and therefore feel a bit cautious about. Does that make sense, David, or if I am I again pushing against something that
No,
doesn't really work?
It makes sense. I think at the end of the day, we are a relatively small island, which should be possible to allow clustering within our small geographical area. How you can actually make that happen with government intervention, I'm not 100% sure where we would add most value in terms of saying company A in the north, please start building a relationship with company B in the south. I think there could be a role for mayors, so metro mayors, and the additional delegation and devolution of powers that they have to facilitate that within their own localities. But I'm not quite sure what the role for central government would be there.
Okay. Does anybody else want to chip in on that one? We've got about a couple of minutes left before we come to the end of the very interesting panel session.
Richard,
please.
I would have thought that could be a potential role for the LEPs. The LEPs have their own networks, but equally they have the knowledge base of those local communities. I mean, kind of trying to match and help and facilitate those kind of relationships, it would seem to me would be a priority. I mean, again, going back to Andy Haldane's point, this is something that the UK, at least in the last 3 or 4 decades, doesn't seem to have kind of got right in this way that you might expect from observations of other countries. So presumably there's a big potential here of kind of kind of structuring a lot of those relationships. And again, I return to my earlier point that I would have thought that the business services, and here I agree with Ingo totally, I would have thought the business services, which is so much the kind of interlocutors, the arbiters of those key knowledge relationships, which tend to be very technical, whether they're legal, about intellectual property, about branding, whatever it is, they would seem to be right in the center of this issue. It's a general issue which the UK, I think, has to make big progress on, and it's just a crucial part of the levelling up story.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think I think you're absolutely right, Philip. It's an important role of the LEPs, and I think when it comes to what interventions can support that, I think we've had a lot of discussion on DIT around an investment in trade and investment activity. So scale up programs, internationalization of business support. improved connectivity itself. I mean, you know, it's topical today, isn't it, to talk about transport links. I also think the one thing that I think has been discussed earlier on in today is around digital, both in terms of skills and infrastructure. I think all those things are going to be really crucial in terms of government interventions that unlock kind of more intensive collaboration. I think there's a lot to do.
Well, I think we've sadly come to that magic moment when I have to thank our panelists. Thank David for their helpful, fantastic contribution. Philip, I'm sorry you couldn't join us at the beginning, but you made it. That was the main thing. Janet, for speaking to us, giving us that really helpful sort of Cabinet Office perspective, and Ingo for that broader economic geographer and trade perspective. And we can be very insular, so I think it's really important to kind of bring in that broader perspective. So I'd like to thank the panel hugely for joining today and addressing some of these key issues around particularly hybrid working and some of the implications it has for productivity. And as Philip says, and I'm sure everybody will be very supportive of his role at the Productivity Institute, because sadly, if there's one thing this country has struggled with, and we don't need Andy Haldane to tell us that, is productivity. And I would like to think that professional services could be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Sadly, because we seem to have grown a little bit slower than we used to, but we were always the biggest contributor. Technically, in economic terms, we're therefore a net contributor to the reduction in productivity. But that's another story for another day. On which happy note, thank you all for your time today. And this ends the formal proceedings for the summit, but for those that wish to stay and network, and I'm afraid the drinks are BYO, bring your own. That's the only sad thing about being virtual. Otherwise, I would have loved to have had a lovely glass of wine with all of you, and thank you hugely for your time, energy, effort, and such an amazing level of expertise that you've brought to this conversation today. And we may not have invented the world, but at least we've identified a couple of issues that might be worth exploring further, and that to me is the mark of any good panel. So thank you hugely. Bye for now.